Hello, everybody. This is our second part of the terminology series. Its subtitled is Terminology versus Critical Thought. By myself, that's Queeving Mokimisi, and the examples that we offer are oligarchy, tyranny, and democracy. These are three words that are very often used in modern political discourse, and we explore what the origins of these words are and what their relationship to reality in the modern sense is. Okay, so we're understanding commonly used political terms in a critical context. Commonly used terms in contemporary political language deserve our attention and criticism, especially when such words are imbued with a very specific, often distorted and unchallengeable meaning within a given dominant narrative. In the previous event of this series, we look at the word terrorism, its official definition, and the conflict over its various politicized applications, uses, and misuses. This time, we investigate three well-used but often misunderstood terms that derive from ancient Greek: oligarchy, tyranny, and democracy. The three forms of government that their city-states in that time were exposed to. They had one of those three types. We then interrogate these forms from several classical and other historical examples, and we question why and to what end they are now understood very differently in the modern context. So Aristotle was the person who came up with these three terms, these three categories, and defined them. He was a famous 4th century, before the Common Era, Athenian philosopher who gives us the best summary of Greek political systems that were known to him. He constructed a theoretical hierarchy of three virtuous political systems, with the monarchy at the top, followed by aristocracy, and then polity. These differ from our contemporary understandings and are contrasted against the three evil systems, again, according to his hierarchy, with democracy at the top of this, followed by oligarchy and tyranny at the very bottom. Aristotle's three virtuous systems are simply, however, idealized mirror images of his three evil ones. So they aren't exactly really three systems. There's just, I mean, six systems. There is actually only three, but there's just one virtuous version and one evil version, according to Aristotle. So, but I'm only going to use the latter terms. So once again, that will be democracy, oligarchy, and tyranny. And I also reject his contrast to a virtuous system against its binary opposite evil counterpart. Geometric Greece, that's the 9th to the 7th centuries before the Common Era, was made up of fragmented kingdoms, each supported by a military aristocracy. These were the periods which followed on from the Mycenaean era, the geometric period. These kings were generally weaker than those of the preceding era, and many were, by the late 7th century, being supplanted by cliques or councils of the kingdom's most powerful nobles. So, therefore, an oligarchy. Greece was typical of the Mediterranean in this period, so it wasn't unique. All Mediterranean city-states more or less fitted into the same pattern. And a similar pattern was developing across the Phoenician and Italian city kingdoms as well. What is interesting is that each king in struggle against his nobles was forced to form an alliance with the commoners. So oligarchic rule, that meaning of the few, was often the norm by the 6th century. Elites within a restricted franchise would periodically elect lawmakers to serve as their representatives. Offices such as the Theban boetarchs, for example, controlled the city and the trade or politics it generated with other cities. Related but better known examples outside the Greek sphere include the Carthaginian / Roman Senate concept. An an ever-growing number of male citizenry needed to be mobilized for military service and to form colonies and to control trade. And this contradiction clashed with the oligarchic rule. As ever more of these commoner warriors, or so-called hoplites, as we know them today, the hoplites, began to demand a say in civic affairs and to gain commensurate legal and political rights. So we can see a picture. This is quite an early era hoplite there on the right, with a Theban shield, a distinctive Theban shield. We don't know what the gap was for exactly, but it certainly lightened the shield and made it easier to run around. Although the militaristic Greek city of Sparta is often misunderstood as subscribing to a monarchical diarchy form of government, that means two monarchs ruling simultaneously, a closer examination reveals it to being much closer, in fact, to an oligarchy, the way in which it was run, that it means. So the two hereditary kings were in fact just war leaders who wielded very little power outside this office. So they had a function, but they didn't control the city. All political, judicial, etc. decisions were subject to the gerousia, or 28-man council, and 5 ephors, who were elected by the between 5,000 and 1,000, depending on the era, full citizens from the military popular assembly. So it was basically a warrior state. It was only the warriors who could vote, and the 28-man council and the 5 ephors were selected. The council was selected by the full citizens, or the military full citizens. It dwindled from, it was around about 5,000 at its outset, and by the end of its its existence, the Spartan hegemony, they dwindled to about 1,000 of them because of their inability to. They suffered from a real difficulty in reproducing their numbers, which we won't go into here because that's another topic in itself. The full citizen or Spartiate voting circle was very select and kept on shrinking due to its innate inability to expand the citizenship. So it's very exclusive, and they also have problems reproducing, as again we won't be going into. So this is a image of the Spartan ephors, and maybe one of the kings or something, allegedly. It doesn't look very convincing historically, but there you go. That's that is supposed to illustrate. Although Sparta, uniquely for Greece, had no slaves, this was simply because it had reduced its neighbors either to a tributary state, that means as subjects, or perioikoi, or to a serf-like bondage known as helatry. This was, as I say, it was more or less similar to the European feudal serf. The former enjoyed limited autonomy, that is the perioikoi, and filled the otherwise absent role within the Spartan state of traders and artisans, and it also provided auxiliary forces for the army, while the latter, that's the helots, were disarmed and disenfranchised. They mainly labored in the lands and the homes of the Spartiates. Other oligarchies lacked these peculiarly Spartan resources, but they could make up for it with the poor, the metics, that's the foreigners, basically, the foreigners with no rights who, for one reason or another, ended up in the city, but didn't have any rights in the city, and slaves as well, filling the subordinate strata. And as Aristotle agreed, oligarchy was an unstable system due to its internal class conflict dynamic. Over there, we can see some images of mainly, I think it's slaves, either being servants in the household or working in the fields. In order to understand tyranny in the Greek sense, we merge two more Aristotelian terms, that of non-hereditary monarchy and its polar opposite, tyranny. We must again understand that Aristotle is not offering us any concrete examples for his opposed systems. So it's very unscientific in that respect. It's just presenting ideal opposites, but one that is divided into two abstract ideals. It is instructive that he makes each binary opposite term his best and worst systems, even though they are, for all intents and purposes, the same form. Real Greek tyrannies arose in a coup or an oppressed pleb uprising, typically catapulting a relative outsider or so-called self-made man into absolute power on the populist ticket of cancelling debts and redistributing wealth. This is a reconfiguration simply of the old alliance between, which we've already been talking about, between the poor and a king. So we can see this is an example tyrant there on the left. I think it might be Dionysius or Agathocles of Syracuse. Although tyrannies were almost universally condemned by the literate noble authors who wrote exclusively about their misdeeds, and no doubt the role also attracted many of a narcissistic and sociopathic nature, if not initially, then certainly as a benevolent so-called autocracy descended into despotism over time. We have several examples of that with the Roman version. It is inconceivable that Greek tyrants had no base to their power in the polis, that's the city-state, beyond their mercenary soldiers and guards. So this is what people like Aristotle would have us believe, is that the only things that were keeping them in power were their mercenary soldiers and they were paying for, and their personal bodyguards. That's not really very viable. There has to be a social base to it. It is for this reason that I, as do increasingly more contemporary critics of the sources, acknowledge that if it was largely the rich who suffered under the tyrants, then tyrants like Agathocles of Syracuse, that's him opposite in the picture, enjoyed, at least for a time, the adulation and support of the poor. So this was the social base that kept the tyrants in power, and they were working against the oligarchs. So, you can understand the dynamic there. The figure of Alexander III of Macedon is particularly interesting in relation to Aristotle's schema because the latter was the young prince's tutor. So that's what Aristotle was doing. He was teaching the young Alexander before he became famous. And although Alexander was a hereditary king who arguably wasn't even Greek, certainly according to some of his critics, didn't even acknowledge that he was Greek, one suspects that Aristotle tried to modify his top ideal of monarchy to suit him. So there's a bit of political power play going on there, and Aristotle is obviously pitching to the young Alexander. Alexander, very much like the tyrants, engaged in constant wars to enrich his soldiers, as did the other tyrants, incidentally, overthrew oligarchies in his path, and founded scores of new imperial polities, polis, each under a democratic framework. No doubt Aristotle would have called such pure new cities his ideal polity form of democracy. If sources are to be trusted, however, Alexander was also to exhibit tyrannical stroke despotic tendencies, especially later on in his life. So democracy, on the other hand, has become so fetishized by only very distantly related 19th to 21st century ideals that we have to disentangle ourselves from such preconceptions to understand what Greek democracy actually was. So we have to scrub what we know about present narratives on the subject and get ourselves into what was the real origins of democracy. Its original and best documented form in the Greek world was that of Athens in the mid 5th to 4th centuries before the Common Era. The sacrifices of the poorer stroke seafaring rower class in the Persian Wars, the sacrifices made for the city to defend the city, and the huge wealth power accrued by this success provided the revolutionary pressure on the city-state to vastly expand its citizen base. So they were forced into it, of course, the oligarchs, but they had to give in. The citizen base, therefore, became much bigger than in an oligarchy, and uniquely, they wielded power directly. That is the democracy, the citizens, they wielded power directly rather than via representatives. We're very used to representative democracy. Direct democracy meant that power was taken away from the magistrates, who were selected by lot and whose task was only to run the courts, services, and infrastructure, and seized instead by the popular assembly of all the citizens who voted together en masse over all political and judicial matters. So there was a sort of yes-no thing. You had different stones, which you selected one of the stones, different colors, you threw them in the box. So it wasn't quite like this here with the raised hands. You can see on the left, though it may have been that way to begin with. Democracy meant the rule of the people, that being 40,000 odd in Athens, which sounds very liberating when compared to, say, Sparta that we've just been dealing with. But we must not forget that the excluded made up about 4 times this number. Firstly, the excluded covered all women, so no woman could vote at all. Then also free foreigners, they were also excluded, the so-called metics. And finally, slaves, as direct democracy went in this period hand in hand with the world's biggest market in chattel slavery. So think about that. There were other problems with democracy as well, that according to Thucydides and reinforced by Aristotle's comments on pure democracy, it was a system open to abuse by demagogues. Aristocratic prejudices, re the hoi polloi, that is the plebs, aside, character traits that in other circumstances may have produced a tyrant could, in the heat of the moment, pass ill-considered declarations of war or abuses of civil liberty against citizens. So the argument here is the hoi polloi can't do anything. They just get swayed by these demagogues and into wars and all the rest of it, ill-considered ones rather than profitable ones, and abuses of civil liberty. So we can see, once again, as with all classical authors, both Greek and Roman, we can see the class prejudices coming out into the open. If we are to critique the direct democracy of the Athenian variety, however, we must be aware that vast property stroke wealth distinctions remained, and the militaristic stroke imperial nature of the state went unchallenged, in addition to its exclusivist stroke exploitative social relations. You can see over there on the right the Athenian agora or marketplace with slaves at work, and a citizen, I think, is buying stuff from them. We can also pass comment on the many contradictions that arise from comparing, say, the democracy of classical Athens and the strict oligarchy of Sparta in an absolute and contemporary conception of the word liberty. We have already seen how Sparta's approach to labor bondage differed to Athens's and more closely resembled serfdom than commercialized chattel slavery. So was this any better? You know, who's doing better or worse? Was it a were you better off as a serf, as a helot in Sparta? Well, not perhaps if you were on the receiving end of the terroristic Spartan crypteria, or secret police. This was a secret police force maintained by the Spartan state who spied on the helots and tortured them and killed them as they saw fit. However, Athenian women were ignored and invisible in public. But in Sparta, on the other hand, if you were a citizen woman, you were able to run rural estates, and you also took part in public events. There's a general Greek practice of, if you were a woman, you stayed at home for the vast majority of it and spent most of it working on a loom in Athens, but in Sparta, you are also maybe managing estates. So you're actually involved in quite important activity of a civic nature. And they could also take part in the races, which was almost unheard of anywhere else in Greece. So you know they could take part in the Olympics. So were these systems of government, like democracy, unique to ancient Greece and Rome in antiquity? Unless one subscribes to an Orientalist mindset, the answer is a resounding no. Firstly, the Roman Republic, much lauded and emulated by the pioneers of Western representative democracy, always remained an oligarchy that was intermittently broken up by dictatorships. So small, short periods of dictatorship, which were similar to the Greek tyrannies. They didn't last very long, usually in Rome. I think there was a limitation on it until Caesar, who became a dictator for life. There was a limitation of 5 years or something. The Persian Empire, for example, is popularly conceived as being the classic stereotype of Oriental despotism, yet it was responsible for the first recorded declaration of universal human rights. That's the king, the first king of the Persian Empire, Cyrus or Cyrus. We have the records of his Declaration of Universal Human Rights on cylindrical tablet which you can see over there on the right. This is a tablet that has been discovered. It's quite revealing. Persia granted its provinces and cities far more autonomy than, for example, Rome ever did. And in addition, chattel slaves, instead of being 10 to 20% of the population in the empires of either Athens or Rome, would have been about 1 to 2% in the Persian Empire, with many of those slaves that they had being owned by its Greek subjects. So pretty much in Asiatic Persia, there was no slavery at all. There was a very small number, generally around the court of the king. Indian and African examples also reveal polities with decentralization and popular power. Also, thanks to surviving law texts, we are able to discern that ancient Celtic and Germanic societies exhibited certain democratic controls over royal power. And in Ireland, in any case, a sharp division existed between judicial and political functions, as well as a higher status for women. We can see a Scandinavian thing or popular assembly over there on the left. Tlaxcala was a confederacy of city-states in Mexico that the Spanish encountered in their conquests in the 16th century. Each city formed a republic and voted in magistrates that sat in the Confederal state senate of 50 to 200 elders. A candidate standing for this senate had to undergo ordeals and examinations to ascertain their suitability for the post. And interestingly, those revealed with an ambition or a obvious to discern ego, these were automatically disqualified. That we could do with maybe some of that in that sort of investigation into politicians in our own society, perhaps. There was very little difference in wealth or even house size between the social classes, while women held high status positions and their important place in the economy was respected. A similar collective rule through councils, and these were often entirely made up of women, is recorded amongst the Iroquois and Wendat peoples in North America. For example, we can see over there on the right, this is a Tlaxcala illustration. There's the high status priestess in the middle with her surrounding followers, her sub-priests, who are male. It is unfortunate that when democracy in the contemporary sense was rediscovered, the theorists responsible for this had such limited understanding and knowledge of even the two systems that they built their models on, namely of Athens and Rome, let alone the other models hiding in plain sight that they bypassed with scorn. I have, in a previous presentation, explained how early capitalism, settler colonialism, and patriarchy came together at the moment when European absolutist monarchy was first being challenged. And the intelligentsia, employed by the rising bourgeoisie, compounded their own ignorance by settling on a very oligarchic form of democracy as their model for a replacement society. And this hangover remains with us today. And so we have over there a picture of philosophers in the 16th century, I think it is. It looks like one of them's picking his nose. The other one's falling asleep, but they are actually supposed to be sort of reconfigured Renaissance philosophers. As to how democracy was understood by the 5 to 10% of adult males entitled to vote in the late 17th to early 19th century cradle of democracy, also known as the UK, I can think of no better example than this one. The Chichester family, male line, all called Arthur, by the way, were in 1613 granted a peerage and Belfast's city civic charter for services to colonial conquest. So they made themselves hangers-on of the royalty in the midst of the colonial conquest of Ireland, and they reaped the bounty. And the bounty was to be awarded the civic charter for Belfast. So they owned all the land rights in the city, and they collected all of the rents, because they were the only legal landowners. Because most of the other people who were sort of in the middle, that is the middle class, were actually Presbyterians who weren't entitled to be proper property owners anyway, and certainly not to serve in the Parliament. So these Chichesters, they appointed the city's mayor and aldermen personally. The eldest male Chichesters could serve either in the Irish Parliament, that's the Parliament in Dublin, as hereditary lords, or if they preferred, in the Commons. So they had a choice. As the only constituent with the rights and sufficient property to vote, being an Anglican, and having the whole place set up to serve his family's interests until 1832. So imagine that's from 1613 to 1832, nearly 200 years. They appointed the MP, which was usually a relative, if they didn't want to do it themselves. And this is called the origins of British democracy. You can see one of the Chichesters over there on the right. I recently attended a history talk where the historian said he was the origin of the phrase "one man, one vote," meaning he was the only one who had a vote in the entire constituency, and he used that accordingly. That's a joke. That's not real. We are today told that we live in something called a democracy. That, as I've been explaining here, is based on very limited representation, whole-scale theft of land and resources, and vast inequalities of wealth and power, and where positions are won by base ambition and corrupt connections, and our voting is restricted by the number of different factors, the latest being voter ID. So this reduces the the number of voters. We can see that in the most recent election in England, where nearly 50% of the population didn't vote. Our democracies are then absurdly pitted against the straw man tyrannies of the others. Again, a familiar trope, as I've already explained, and the only constant is the dominance of a hierarchical narrative and the absence of critical thought. Would it not be truer to state that we all live in a world run by oligarchies of one sort or another? A word from this lexicon, yet curiously absent from everybody's lips. It is important to understand that whatever democratic rights the vast majority of us enjoy today as citizens were only won with our blood and hard struggle from the late 18th century onwards. And even these limited gains remain constantly in danger of being rolled back. We still live in a world where the reasonable concept of democracy in the workplace, for example, remains utterly alien to mainstream understanding. As Professor Noam Chomsky has commented, every day we go to work, we enter a dictatorship. So just think about that one. This shows how spuriously our society takes the investigation of what a democracy can really be. That's the end of the presentation.